Okay, we're live. Thanks. Hello, everybody. I'm Ken Follett, and I'm very happy to be here. Hello, everybody. I'm Ken Follett, and I'm very happy to be at home with four indies this evening. Most of us, I'm sure, know the pleasure of browsing in an independent bookstore, and it's great to be able to give them a little bit of support at a very difficult time. I have a new book coming out. It's out on the 15th of September, and it's called The Evening and the Morning, and it's set at a time when three great powers are struggling for control of England: the Anglo-Saxons, the Vikings, and the Normans. The Anglo-Saxons, who lived here; the Vikings, who for a long time treated England as a supermarket where you didn't have to pay. They showed up in their marvellous fast boats, and they murdered people and raped and stole, and they were slave traders also. They took young people as slaves in England, and then off they went again, usually to sell what they had stolen, whether silver crosses from the church or young people from the village. So this is a time of tremendous conflict, and of course, when you get that kind of conflict in history, there are lots of very exciting and moving individual stories about ordinary people who are caught up in this kind of thing, or actually part of it, trying to fight against it, trying to fight for one side or another. This is a kind of prequel to The Pillars of the Earth, and I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. But first, the characters. I've got a young boat builder who is one of the principal characters, a gorgeous Norman princess who comes from Normandy to England to get married, a gay monk, and the character who I hope you're going to hate as much as I hate him, whose name is Bishop Winston. And I trust that before too long you will be longing for him to meet a very unpleasant death, and I can assure you that eventually he will. The book is a sort of prequel, I mentioned, to The Pillars of the Earth. Now, I've written, in The Pillars of the Earth, the cathedral is built in a town called Kingsbridge. And afterwards, when I wrote World Without End, which is about the Black Death in the 14th century, I was thinking about how to show the effects of this terrible plague on ordinary people in an English town or village. And I thought, well, why not take Kingsbridge? Here is a town that my readers like, and they know and feels familiar, and maybe they'd be interested to see what it's like 200 years later, and to see how the people of the town that built the cathedral coped with probably the most terrible plague ever to afflict the human race. So I set World Without End in Kingsbridge, and then when I wrote A Column of Fire, I had a very similar thought. A Column of Fire is about the terrible religious wars of the 16th century. And I thought, let's show the effect of those wars on people in Kingsbridge. So Kingsbridge has become the kind of representative town of England in these historical stories that I've done. And so finally I thought, I wonder what Kingsbridge was like before it became a big important city. You know, was it a village? Was it even just a little settlement with a handful of houses? And then how did it grow? What happened? And you know, when something like this happens, a village grows into a town, there are always conflicts between people who love the changes and want to go with them, and people who are really happy with the way things used to be and don't want to change. And that's the kind of conflict that makes good stories. So The Evening and the Morning is set in a village that will eventually turn into Kingsbridge over time. The novel covers 10 years. It actually begins in the year 997 and finishes 10 years later. And this is, as well as being this moment in the history of our fictional town, it's also this important moment in the story of England and how it came to be, Britain really, how Britain came to be what it is today. So I hope that when that book appears on the 15th of September, I hope that you will enjoy it. And if you're going to buy it, why don't you buy it in either Lingham or Bookish or Forum or Book A and support the independent bookstores who are putting on this Facebook Live for us this evening. I've got some questions from you. I've also been asked to read a bit. In fact, I might read a bit from The Evening and the Morning, because there's a moment. I usually read the beginning of the book because, you know, the beginning always explains a lot. But I thought I'd choose a very short passage. Take me about 2 minutes, if that. The gorgeous Norman princess that I mentioned is now in England. Her name is Ragnar. And she's going to marry an Anglo-Saxon ealdorman, kind of chieftain, called Wilf. They're not married yet, but they're going to get married soon. And one morning, she's quite a bad girl, this Ragnar. So one morning, she goes to his bedroom early in the morning. As Ragnar stepped inside, she heard a deep growl. Wilf had a dog to warn him of intruders. Ragnar looked towards where she knew the bed to be. There was a glow from the embers of the fire and a faint light coming through the small windows. She saw a figure sit up in bed and reach for a weapon. Wilf's voice said, "Who's there?" Ragnar said quietly, "Good morning, my lord." She heard him chuckle. "It's a good morning now you're here." He lay down again. There was movement on the floor, and she saw a big mastiff resume his position, lying by the fire. She sat on the edge of the bed. This was a delicate moment. Her mother had urged her not to lie with Wolf until after the ceremony. He would want it, Genevieve had said, and Ragnar had known that she would want it too, but she was determined to resist the temptation. She could not say exactly why this was so important, especially as they had already done it once. Her feelings had to do with how happy they both would be about their marriage when at last they were able to yield to their desires without guilt or fear. All the same, she kissed him. There's a very strong bond between Wilf and Ragnar, but there are also some problems as well, cross-cultural problems between the rather civilized, rather sophisticated Normans and the not quite so sophisticated Anglo-Saxons. And that's a big part of the story of The Evening and the Morning. I always like the questions from participants in these events. And I've got some that have been sent to me by our 4 independent booksellers in advance. And one of the questions is, what were you like at school? And I thought, am I going to answer this question or what? I was very bad. It's a very bad boy at school. I was always in trouble. I was always getting punished for misbehaviour, disobedience. One of my reports said he is inclined to be troublesome and disobedient, and that pretty much sums up my school career for probably the first 8 or 9 years, from primary until about the age of 13 or 14. I just hated it, and I know why I was so badly behaved. I was bored. I was bored out of my tree. And so I messed about. I made the class laugh. I tried to subvert the teacher, all that sort of stuff. Very familiar. All of us will remember most classes had one boy like that, and I was it. And then, as if by magic, when I got to about 13 or 14, schoolwork became interesting. I wasn't bored anymore. I was challenged. Maths and chemistry became quite challenging subjects. I was really interested in learning French. I must confess that English was never very difficult for me. That came to me naturally. But some of the subjects were both interesting and challenging, and life changed, and I became a sort of a more or less well-behaved pupil, and passed all my exams and all that. So those were my school days. We also, when I was younger, we also had a lot of very prissy, old teachers who just made no connection with the kids, who just, I remember they used to put sums on the board, multiplication and long division. Be 20 of these boring sums on the board, and the teacher would go. Anyway, the next question is, did a teacher spot your potential? And this happened in a funny way, in that I wrote a story, and this was before I was 10 years old. I wrote a story. They were called compositions, but this was a fictional story. And they said, you copied this out of a book, didn't you? And I said, no, I made it up. And they said, no, you didn't. You didn't make this up. You didn't write this yourself. You copied it out of a book. And I said, no, I didn't. I was taken to the office of the headmistress and accused again of copying something out of a book and presenting it as my own work. And I said, no. It was a story that began with somebody seeing a plane crash. That was all. Looked up in the sky. There was a plane. There was smoke coming out of it. And this person saw the plane come down and disappear behind the trees. It was just quite a good beginning, an intriguing beginning to the story, thought I at the age of 10. And the teachers obviously thought so too, because they said I couldn't possibly have made it up. I think eventually they believed me. I remember sitting in the head teacher's study, wondering what on earth I was going to do to get out of this, and I certainly wasn't going to pretend I'd made it up. So that was that was the teacher that spotted my potential. I'm often asked, what's your favourite period of history? And of course it's the Middle Ages. I have enjoyed so much writing about the Middle Ages. And I think the attraction of the Middle Ages is that the people were like us. People don't, it's 800 years ago, people don't change, people don't evolve very much over 800 years. Medieval people, we are very similar to medieval people in almost every way, but their lives were so different, you see. Their lives were very cold and hard and brutal, and often violent. I mean, people who say that crime is worse today than it ever has been just have no idea what they're talking about. There was far more crime in the Middle Ages, far more murders and rapes and kidnapping and all that sort of thing. So when we read, we read about these people who are like us, and whose lives are tremendously brutal. And I believe most people think, how would I have coped? How could I have managed? How would I have lived in a society like that? With so much hunger and violence and injustice and early death. Recently they have been excavating some historians have been excavating a graveyard in the west of England. I was reading about this the other day, and they've been aging the skeletons to discover at what age people died, and most women died before the age of 35 in the period I'm talking about now, the Dark Ages, the Anglo-Saxon period. 35, no doubt that was because of the hazards of childbirth. Men a little bit longer, but not very much. Most men died by the time they got to the age, before they got to the age of 45. So that's the kind of society that we're talking about. So that's my favourite period of history to write about. Let's see. Lots of very nice people saying hello. Kerry Poole, Katie Stevenson, Esteban Navas, Tracy Dunbar from Oswestry, Anne Field, Mary Sula from Rochester, Minnesota, USA. And Joanna Rawlins asks, where will we be able to buy a signed copy of the latest novel? So excited to read this. That's very nice of you. I've already signed, actually, thousands. So you should be able to buy signed copies of The Evening and the Morning somewhere or other. I'm not sure what. Joanna Rawlins sounds like an English-speaking person. So I've signed 8,000 for the United States, and I'll be signing more shortly for the UK. So you should be able to find them. Esteban Navas asks, is that Edgar Allan Poe behind me? There is a statuette just above my finger, and it is a statuette of Edgar Allan Poe, but it's a prize. It's an award from the Mystery Writers of America, and when they give out this prize, the prize is a statuette of Edgar Allan Poe, who's considered to be the writer of some of the first mysteries, and I won. They were kind enough to give me a Lifetime Achievement Award. And just moving along a little bit, let me see if I can point my finger at that. That is the same statuette, actually, that I won in 1979 for Eye of the Needle, which was chosen as best novel of 1978 by the Mystery Writers of America. So in my career, I've won 2 Edgars, one at the beginning and one, let's say, in the middle. We have greetings from Malcolm McMaster in hazy, hot and humid New Jersey, USA. Now then, let's have another question. Have you written any manuscripts in your early days which you are tempted to revive and publish? Now, I don't think I've got any manuscripts. I mean, in the early days, my books were published. I was very fortunate in that way. And, but the early books didn't sell. And, you know, not to beat about the bush, that was because they weren't good enough. And so there are some of those early books that have never been republished. 1 or 2 that aren't too bad have been published. Modigliani Scandal and Paper Money are both early books which, when they first came out, were not terrifically successful and have been republished since. But there are 6 or 7 novels from the early 70s that I wrote that I will not. I'm not going to ask you to buy those books. I don't think they're good enough, and you know, I value the fact that people like my books, and I'm not going to you know, I'm not going to jeopardize that feeling by asking you to buy a book that I don't think is very good. So there's nothing from the early days now that is going to be published, because the only things that haven't been published are things that I don't think are good enough. Let's see. Valerie Regalia asks me, which of my characters do you think I'm most... Which of your characters do you think you're most similar to? It's a good question, Valerie. Um, I don't really know. I mean, there is often, in one of my books, there is often a young man who sort of comes from nowhere and has a skill and is successful and prosperous. And I suppose that's me. I don't come from a wealthy family. I'm from a very average family, but I was gifted this imagination. I've lived in my imagination, all my life. When I was a boy, I was always pretending to be a cowboy or captain of a pirate ship, or I was on a spaceship. And I lived in my imagination, and I have spent the last 45 years making up stories in my imagination and writing them down to share with you. So the imaginative young men like Jack in The Pillars of the Earth, and in the new book Edgar, who I mentioned to you as a shipbuilder, they have something in common with me. They have skills that I don't have, of course. Jack is a builder, Edgar a shipbuilder, and I couldn't do either of those things to save my life. But I suppose what we have in common is aspiration. The character I'm not like is Prior Philip in The Pillars of the Earth. That book had to have at least one admirable character who's a sincere Christian. The book is about building a cathedral. It had to take religion seriously. I'm not a believer myself. I'm an atheist. Nevertheless, I love the cathedrals. And so I had to create an admirable and sincere Christian. But I made Prior Philip a very practical Christian. He never tells people, you're having a hard time now, but life will be much better in the hereafter. He never says that. He tries to make people's lives better in this life, not in the afterlife. And that's the kind of Christian that I come across quite frequently and admire. Those people are often very hard-working and sincere activists in the interests of disadvantaged people, and I've met them and worked with them, and I admire them. And Philip is like that. So, but he is nevertheless a character that is basically not like me. Ambra Petrocelli, is this the last book in the series, or can we expect a sequel to A Column of Fire? I don't know. I am writing another book now, of course. I'm always writing another book. The new book is not in the Kingsbridge series. Afterwards, I don't know. If a wonderful idea occurs to me and I think, oh my goodness, I can't wait to write that story, then of course I'll write it. And if it's a Kingsbridge story, so much the better. And if it's not, I'll still write it. Christina Perez Garcia wants to know when I first got published. That must have been 1973 or 74. I was working as a newspaper reporter, and a colleague on the paper wrote a thriller and got it published. And I thought, well, if he can do it, maybe I can. And I wrote a thriller. It wasn't actually very good, and it's one of those books that is not going to be republished. But it was good enough to get published. It must have had something. And so that was I'm pretty sure that was 1973. First book published. Not a big success. Not even a small success. Not even a modest success. It didn't sell particularly well at all. But it got published. I mean, that was very important. It got published. And so after putting in all that effort, sitting at home in the evenings writing this story instead of watching TV or going to the pub or reading a book, after all that effort, I had something to show for it. I had a couple of £100 too, which was worth having in those days. And so I was enormously encouraged by having those early books published, 1973. Robert Goldberg, is the Bayeux Tapestry mentioned in your new novel? Yes. Oh, well, it's not mentioned in the novel. No, sorry, because the novel finishes in the year 1007, and the tapestry was done in about 1080, I believe. But nevertheless, the tapestry is very important because it is the best historical document about this period. For those who don't know, Bayeux tapestry is a work of embroidery. Technically, it's not a tapestry at all. It's a work of embroidery, coloured wool on linen, and it's like a strip cartoon. And it shows it's in sections about this big, about a yard long, about less than a metre, I would say. And it tells the story of the Norman conquest of England, and sort of accidentally, it shows us all kinds of aspects of everyday life in the 11th century. So we see, for example, a group of chaps sitting down having a jolly dinner, and you can see the cutlery they used and the plates. One of them's guzzling. He's drinking from a drinking horn. You can see the servants serving them. You can see the servants cooking the dinner. I mentioned that one of my characters is a boat builder, and the Bayeux tapestry shows people building boats, chopping down the trees, smoothing the planks, putting the planks together. Very useful for me. I wondered for a long time, until I looked at the tapestry, I wondered, how did people board ships in the 11th century? Because there weren't any docks, no quays. I imagined they might have got in little rowing boats and rowed out to the ships in the harbour, but actually the ships were not that far out in the harbour, and what people did was they hitched up the skirts of their tunics. In those days, men wore a dress type garment, as well as women, shortish on the men and floor length on the women, hitched up their garments, and they waded through the water. And there's a very charming image in the tapestry of a chap carrying his dog as he wades through the water with his bare legs. I don't know why he's carrying his dog. Dogs can swim, can't they? So maybe it was a very precious dog. But anyway, it's full of that sort of thing, as well as some details. Stirrups, for example. So you can't fight on horseback without stirrups. You just fall off. So stirrups are a very important invention. And did they have them in the 11th century? That question is answered by the Bayeux tapestry. I've been to see the Bayeux tapestry, of course, it's in Bayeux, actually, in a museum. There's also a copy in a museum in England, in the town of Reading, about 30 miles from London. And I studied both, and then, of course, I've also got reproductions, small-size reproductions of the tapestry that I can study here at my desk. This is my desk. This is my library. This is where I work all day. And of course, during the lockdown, my working day really hasn't changed. Before the lockdown and after, I have for a long time sat here all day writing the next book. Let's see what other questions we might have. Esteban Navas sends me greetings from Chile. Laura Panther asks, who's been your favourite character you have written? And I think I talked about Prior Philip and said that he'd been difficult to write, but in the end he's my favourite character. I like him a lot. Andreas Hedberg says, would you ever consider writing a sci-fi novel? You know, Andreas, when I started out trying to write short stories, when I was about 21, I wrote lots of short stories. None of them were ever published. But I started trying to write science fiction, and I found that I couldn't. And I wondered why, and I think it's because the stories I write now are imaginary stories set in the real world. even if it's a period in history, it's the real world. A science fiction writer has to not only invent the story, he has to invent the whole world. You know, it's set in the future, or it's a distant planet, or it's in a universe where all the rules are different. The science fiction writer needs, I've got a good imagination, but a science fiction writer needs an incredible imagination. And I admire those chaps and women, many very good, very enjoyable female science fiction writers. I admire them enormously, and having tried, I know that I'm not able to write like that. Science fiction. Let's see. Leo Jovanovic, have you ever been tempted to write a book in which the evil character is the main character? Well, now for a minute. Well, now think about Eye of the Needle. It's the story of a German spy in England in the Second World War. And he's terrible. You know, he kills lots of people. He's a murderer. And yet, when you get into that story, and you know, he's found out the deception plan for the Normandy invasion, and he's trying to get home with the information. And if he does, it will totally mess up the plan for the D-Day invasion. And yet, you will find yourself, I know this because readers do, you'll find yourself kind of hoping things are going to be all right for him. So, yes, he is the evil character, and he's the central character in the story. Of course, there is a terrific good character who will probably defeat him, because the Allies will probably win the war. The Pillars of the Earth was an amazing success. Did you realise how popular this would be? No. I thought it would be popular. I thought it could be. This story about building a cathedral, I thought it could be a terrific popular novel. I didn't want to write, you know, a book that would win the Booker Prize, that kind of thing. I wasn't aiming at that. I was aiming at something more like Gone with the Wind. And I was right. It was a good enough idea to be that. But I must confess that I didn't ever anticipate the scale of the success of the Pillars of the Earth. It's, you know, it's been out for more than 30 years now, and it's sold something like 1 million copies a year over 30 years. It's not quite that, but near. It's amazing. I mean, I find it hard to take in. How did I write something that many people would love? There we are. So the answer is no. I didn't know. Where did you get the original idea from? This is another question about the Pillars of the Earth. And that book is inspired by the cathedrals. Before I ever thought of writing that book, I used to visit cathedrals. I was very interested. I was very struck by how beautiful they were. Something about the ordered regularity of the architecture appealed to me enormously. The arches, one after another, down the nave, standing in line, like soldiers at attention. Something about that appealed to me enormously. And of course, I mean, the big appeal was thinking about the people who built them, because we know that the medieval builders were poor. They lived in huts, wooden huts, slept on the floor, didn't make much money. They didn't have power tools. Everything was done with hammer and chisel, and a lot of guesswork. You know, they didn't have the mathematics to calculate the stresses in those structures. I mean, all of those medieval cathedrals were built by people who had no idea about the mathematics of objects like that. And so I was kind of amazed and intrigued, and I got more and more interested in how did they do it? How did they do that? And why? Why did they want? I look at a cathedral and I think, why did they want one of these? What drove them to this tremendous achievement of engineering and design, engineering and art? And so it was not so much getting an idea, it was more getting absorbed in something and gradually realizing that while I was getting absorbed in this, I was researching the material for what could be a popular novel. So that's where the idea came from. Where did the title of The Evening and the Morning come from? It's called The Evening and the Morning because this moment in history, in European history, is the end of the Dark Ages and the beginning of the Middle Ages. The Dark Ages were a very dark time. Some historians dispute that. Some historians say there was a great Anglo-Saxon civilization. I don't really buy that. You know, there was a great Roman civilization, an ancient Greek civilization, and most of what they achieved was lost by Europeans after the Roman Empire collapsed. You know, the Anglo-Saxons came to England where there were still brick villas standing, and they ignored these villas and built their wooden huts in the fields next to the villas. They lost the theatre. Greeks built theatres. The Romans built theatres. They had playwrights. And the playwright Terence, who wrote in Latin, was studied by schoolboys in Shakespeare's time. Shakespeare probably read, almost certainly read Terence's plays in Latin. And they were just lost in the Dark Ages. There was no theatre in the Dark Ages. There were no plays. There wasn't a theatre in England until about 1575, I think it was. First one was built. It was called The Theatre, and it was built on the outskirts of London. The Dark Ages lost all that. Pottery from the Dark Ages just isn't as good as Roman pottery. So it was I think it was a bad time, and the Middle Ages was a terrific renaissance. People learned how to build in stone. The cathedrals are from the Middle Ages. They are not from the Dark Ages. They built stone castles. They eventually, medieval people got back in touch with Greek and Roman culture. And the great Greek mathematician Euclid, lost to Europe, rediscovered in a Muslim museum and translated. He wrote in Greek, but he was translated from Arabic into Latin by English monks working in Spain. You may want to take notes at this point. But so there was the Dark Ages, then there was the medieval rebirth, and the morning and the evening is set at the turning point of that process. I like turning points, you know, stuff is happening. People are always quarrelling about stuff that's happening. Some people want the changes, some people resist the changes. That's how you get a story. Let's see what else we've got here. Bookish is telling us where you can pre-order The Evening and the Morning. Thank you, Bookish. Hello and welcome from all at Booker. Esteban Navas likes that there are always LGBT characters in my stories. There was actually a moment in my career when I realized that I was writing about a very restricted range of people, and I made a decision to expand my range. That was a conscious decision, and it's a long time ago now, but I'm very glad that I did it. Let's see what we've got. Can you describe your day when writing? Well, I mentioned that a bit. I like to start early. I wake up early and I come and I make a cup of tea and then I come and sit here and I read what I wrote yesterday. Now, this is typically about 6 o'clock in the morning that I do this. Read what I wrote yesterday. Always find ways to improve it. Sometimes I tear it up and do it all again. Sometimes I just make improvements. And then I write for 2 or 3 hours, have breakfast, write until lunchtime, have lunch. And I write for the early part of the afternoon, and round about 4 o'clock I find that I'm running out of steam. It's not a bad day after all. If you start that early, you can finish at 4 o'clock and you've done a good day's work. But my imagination doesn't work so well later in the day. Don't have so much energy. So at that point, I have a look at the emails and the post and do a little bit of that kind of business. And then I usually have a glass of champagne. This is not champagne, this is water. I thought I'd better stay stone cold sober to speak to you in case there are any difficult questions, which there aren't. How was lockdown for you? Well, I've mentioned, I think, that it hasn't made any difference to my working life, not a great difference. Made a big difference to my family life, of course. I haven't seen my children and grandchildren for 3 months, and I certainly miss that. And I haven't seen my friends. I haven't played in the band for 3 months. In fact, the last social event I went to at the end of March was a gig which the band played for a dance at a rugby club. Let's see what else we have here. What tips, Karina Hawk asks an interesting question. What tips do you have for providing your characters a unique voice? Now actually, you see, like most writers, I don't really give the characters a voice. I'm afraid to say that most of them talk like me. And that's true of most writers. A few novelists have the knack of giving you a character through his speech. Charles Dickens is famous for doing that. Steve King can do it very, very well today. But most people have the characters in their stories talk more or less the way they do. There are lots of other ways to give characters their unique personality. And part of the trouble with giving a character a voice like that is that you find yourself sort of writing an accent phonetically or putting in errors of grammar or something, and it's got a tendency to become a bit condescending. So I shy away from that. Albrecht Morhardt says, what is the main skill that a writer should have? You need two, actually, because you need the imagination to invent a story that nobody's ever told before. And then you need the ability to write it down in such a way that others can share it, other people can share it. And that's a completely separate skill. Lots of people who have one or the other. And those of us who write novels are lucky enough to have both. You have to be able to imagine the story, and that, I mean, if that either happens to you, that happens to me all the time, willy-nilly. I have no control over it. I imagine stuff all the time. But the writing it down comes from two things. It comes from a lot of reading. That's the most important thing. But there's also a discipline to it. You have to learn the ability to look at what you've written and read it as if you don't know in advance what it's going to say. You have to be able to look at your sentence and say, will somebody understand exactly what I mean by this? And if you're a writer like me who wants to be popular, the person has to understand it instantly. Nobody wants to read the sentence twice to figure out what it means, unless you're reading that kind of writer, and that kind of writer does give great pleasure to many people. I occasionally read that kind of writer myself. I'm a big fan of Proust, and you certainly have to read his sentences twice to understand them in English or French. No easier in English than they are in French. But for my kind of story, the reader must get that sentence's meaning immediately and effortlessly. This is a pleasure. It's supposed to be a pleasure. It's not supposed to be difficult. It must never be a slog. I was asking Barbara, my wife, about a novel she was reading the other day, and she said, well, it's a bit of a slog. And I thought, God forbid that anybody should ever say that about one of my books. It's not supposed to be a slog. It's supposed to be a joy. It's supposed to be like, you know, going down a slide or something. You just enjoy the speed and the pace and the view and so on. So I think those are the two. Those are the two skills that we've got to have. From where do you get the initial research material? Says Debasri Banerjee. Where did you find it when you were new to the craft? When I started, well, first I didn't do any research for my early novels. That's one of the reasons why they weren't any good. I just, you know, used stuff from my own knowledge and the city where I lived, and I didn't find out about other places and other periods in history and so on. And that's one of the reasons why my first novels weren't very good, because I didn't research. Now, that's not true of every writer. There are plenty of writers who never do any research and write the most brilliant novels. And my friend Lee Child is one of them. He doesn't research, he doesn't plan. He just sits down and writes a sentence and thinks, what should I put next? I'm not that kind of writer. I have to plan and I have to research. So the first book I researched was Eye of the Needle, also my first success. And I had to research everyday life in wartime Britain. And I did it at the local public library. I read books about everyday life in wartime. I did have a friend, another writer, older man, who remembered wartime. Been a boy during the war, and gave me a lot of help. Read the whole thing, Eye of the Needle, chapter by chapter as I was writing it, and gave me some little corrections about what you could buy and what you couldn't buy, and how much cigarettes cost and all that sort of thing. So in the early days, and there was no internet, so you couldn't just it wasn't so easy. I had to get in the car and drive to the public library and look along the shelves. I couldn't just Google anything. Nobody could in those days. But I must say, even then, if you were persistent, you could find out just about anything that was generally known. Now, I think let's have... I think we've got time for one more question. So here's the last question. The Century Trilogy was a huge concept. How difficult was this to write? It was very difficult. And, I didn't know whether it was even possible to tell the story of an entire century in 3 novels. When I set out on this project, I had a secret plan, which was that if I realized that this was actually impossible, then I was going to confess after a year or so writing it. If it wasn't working, I was just going to call a press conference and say to everybody, I'm really sorry, I told you I was going to do this, and I've discovered that it's just an impossible project. And I would have given the money back to the publishers and all that. So I really didn't know that it was ever going to happen. But in fact, that first book, Fall of Giants, the first book in the Century Trilogy, just went so well. It starts in South Wales before the First World War. I come from South Wales, and my grandfather Evans was a coal miner. Briefly, he got out of the pits, but before the First World War, he was a coal miner, and so that South Wales culture is very familiar to me, and I still remember all about it. Although, I mean, it was dying when I was a boy. It was still going, although it was on the way out. And the mining industry then eventually died in the early 80s under Margaret Thatcher. But there was still that culture, and I enjoyed using a lot of that South Wales culture. And so the book began. The experience of writing it began marvellously well, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. It was one of the challenges was that all of these it was not that difficult to figure out which were the grand historical events of the 20th century that just had to be in the trilogy. Obviously, the First World War, the Russian Revolution, the Nazis and the Second World War, and the Cold War, the Americans and the Russians, nuclear weapons, Cuban Missile Crisis, civil rights. That wasn't difficult. The challenge was to put members of the families, the fictional families that I'd created, to make sure that they were not just observers, but participants in these great events. And that was a terrific technical challenge, actually, without seeming too artificial. You know, the one or two books there are that are a bit like this, that tell a lot. For example, Herman Wouk, The Winds of War and War and Remembrance, does it marvellously well, and those books were tremendously successful. But quite a lot of the time his characters are observers, and I wanted my characters to be participants. I wanted them to be soldiers or revolutionaries or victims of the Nazis or people campaigning for civil rights, not just people watching all this stuff happen. And that was the great challenge. But I worked it out in the end. And I suppose that phrase, that sentence, I worked it out in the end, could be taken to summarize my entire career. I started out writing novels. They weren't very good, but I worked it out in the end. And you know, The Pillars of the Earth was a very difficult book to write. Very long. Took me more than 3 years, but I worked it out in the end. And the same with the Century Trilogy. I worked it out in the end. And I'm now writing a new story, which I hope will be out about 2 years from now. And it's all right. Might not be good enough yet, but I'll work it out in the end. It's been a pleasure talking to you. I hope you've enjoyed it. And I hope that when the evening and the morning comes out, you will stroll along to Lingham or Bookish or Forum or Book A and buy a copy and keep your independent bookshop going, not just with my books, buy some others as well. Buy some others instead if you like, I really don't mind. And thank you very much for joining me. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. And